Ladies and gentlemen, if I may invite your attention here, we'll get our program underway. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Hoover Institution in Washington, D.C. I'm David Davenport, and I'm the director of the Hoover's programs here, although my residence is still at the Hoover Institution in California. But I spend a week or two a month here in Washington, D.C. With the Hoover Institution. I might just start by giving you a quick context for these offices. I would have to say that Hoover spent the first 95 years of its history, roughly, deliberately avoiding Washington, D.C. as much as possible. It was almost an article of faith that we were in California, not in Washington, D.C. But actually, our Hoover fellow Todd Lindbergh here on the front row brought us into Washington, D.C., maybe 15 years ago, when we took over Policy Review, which Todd edited, and it had a small office over on DuPont Circle. And eventually we decided a couple of years ago that we should have a little more robust presence for the institution as a whole. So this office opened about a year ago. And the experiment is to build a bridge between the Hoover Fellows and their academic policy work in California and the very interesting people and policy conversations that take place here in Washington, D.C. And it is an interesting experiment, I think, to see if there is an openness, a receptivity to the kind of serious academic work that Hoover scholars do in the policy world, and to match that up with policy thinkers and practitioners here in Washington, whether government, academic, think tank, media, and so on. And so that's what we're doing here at Hoover in Washington, D.C. We're delighted you joined us. Just a word about logistics, and then we're going to jump right into the program. We Californians are quite informal, and so feel free to revisit the bar and the dessert table at any time. Restrooms are right outside the glass doors that you entered. We're actually going to build in a break after lunch at about 1:15, so there will be a break for restrooms and coffee and so forth at 1:15 before we start the panels at 1:30. But if you need a break of any other kind, feel free to create your own opportunity. So I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, and in the process of doing that, maybe to lay a bit of context for our program today. Of course, most of you either know or certainly know of Francis Fukuyama and his outstanding work. He is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University, a resident in their Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. He's also a professor of political science at Stanford, and we have dragged him over to the Hoover Institution to participate in a working group we have on foreign policy and grand strategy. He's written widely on issues of development and international politics. Of course, we all know about his book, The End of History and the Last Man in 1982. But we're really here to talk today about his two-volume, if you will, two most recent books, or two-volume treatment. First, The Origins of Political Order, published in 2011, and then the second sort of companion volume, Political Order and Political Decay, published in late 2014. That particular book, Literary Review, for example, said these two books may be Fukuyama's most impressive work to date, which would be a strong compliment given everything else Frank has done. He has his BA from Cornell in classics, a PhD from Harvard in political science. He taught in political science and worked in political science at Rand, was on the policy planning staff at the Department of State, previously taught at Johns Hopkins and at George Mason. At least one of his former students is here. I met probably more than one. He served on the President's Council on Bioethics from 2001 to 2014. As I mentioned, though, what really inspired this conference was this book published late 2014 on political order and political decay. Paul Verkuyl, chair of the Administrative Conference of the United States, and I were talking about this book and decided it would be fun to spend an afternoon, if we could, with Frank and some other smart people to really think about the significant implications of this book. And so we put together this joint effort, co-hosted by the Administrative Conference of the United States, chaired by Paul, also the Stanford Law School today, and it will be represented on one of the panels. The Hoover Institution also represented on one of the panels, to spend some real time with this book. And the way we plan to proceed is to invite Frank to give a sort of an opening keynote message here. Then we'll take a short break, then to come back, and we have two panels as advertised to explore two particular topics of this book. And it is, I just was joking, if I had finished the book before I issued the invitations, I might not have invited federal judges to come today. We have two very distinguished federal judges, Frank, I have to warn you. But they are open-minded and have live, bright, active minds of their own, and I don't think Frank will duck from some stimulating conversation with them and the rest of us. There really is a lot to get our arms around, and so by, I think, selecting two topics, we at least have a realistic agenda for this afternoon. So that's our plan for the day. My favorite, I'll just mention one of many. My favorite review of his book in The Economist says, a basic rule of intellectual life is that celebrity destroys quality. The more famous an author becomes, the more likely he is to produce hot air. Continuing in the next paragraph, Francis Fukuyama is a glorious exception to this rule. These two books rest on an astonishing body of learning. So with no further introduction, I'll introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Francis Fukuyama.
Still on? Yes, okay, good. All right, well, thank you very much, David, for that very kind introduction and for hosting this session. I really want to thank Paul Verkuig because in his role as head of the Administrative Conference of the United States, he's been extremely supportive of a collaboration and many of the things that I've done. So thank you all for being here, and panelists as well. So my book started out as an effort to rewrite Samuel Huntington's classic 1968 book, Political Order in Changing Societies. You might note, if you are familiar with that book, that the first chapter was entitled Political Order and Political Decay, and that became the title of the second volume of this series. It seemed to me that Huntington had some very important insights about the nature of development, the complex nature of the way that political and economic development interacted, but it needed to be updated, and that was the origin of this project. For the session today, the two books cover a lot of ground, but I want to focus really on the United States, or I want to end up focusing on the United States, because I think that the framework provides some, a way of thinking about the problem of American government. So let me just begin with this tripod, or this tripartite set of institutions, which is the way that I conceptualize what a modern liberal democracy is. So I think that there are three basic, very different sets of institutions on which a political order rests. The first is the state. I like Max Weber's classic definition of the state as a legitimate monopoly of force over territory. I think that that distinguishes it from other kinds of social institutions, but the important word, well, all of the words are important, but particularly the legitimate use of force. States are about power. They're about the ability to generate power and to use it to enforce laws, to protect the community, to deliver basic services and the like. Second set of institutions is the rule of law. You can have rule by law, which are simply commands of the sovereign, but I think a true rule of law is fundamentally a constraint on power. That is to say, it is something that binds the executive and forces the executive to operate by rules that are approved by the broader community. And then finally, you have institutions of democratic accountability. We understand these today to be free and fair multi-party elections. And again, the point of these procedures is to guarantee that the government follows as closely as possible the wishes of the whole community rather than the narrow self-interest of the people that happen to be running the government. Now, there is a tension built into these three institutions. The state is about accumulating and using power, whereas the rule of law and democratic accountability are fundamentally about constraining power. And so a proper and a just modern political system, in my view, must consist of a balance between these institutions. If you have all state and no constraint, then you have something like China, which has a very modern bureaucratic, meritocratic system, but no rule of law and, of course, no democratic accountability. At the far end, you might take Libya now, or Syria, or Iraq as cases where there is no state, no fundamental monopoly of force, and that's not a very good situation either. Another really critical definition is between a modern state and either a patrimonial or a neo-patrimonial state. So, you know, the term patrimonial, again, comes from Max Weber. A patrimonial state is one in which the rulers regard the state as patrimony, meaning it's part of their private property, and they exploit it for their own purposes. So in the days of kings and queens, you literally could give away a province to your daughter as a wedding present. Today, nobody dares to actually be quite that brazen. So we have this phenomenon that comparativists call neo-patrimonialism, in which, you know, Nigeria, let's say, is a good example of this. You have institutions that look like they're modern, but in fact the state is run by a bunch of insiders for their own private enrichment. Barry Weingast and Doug North and John Wallace refer to this as a limited access order, that you know, essentially it's a rent-seeking coalition to extract resources. A modern state, by contrast, is impersonal, meaning that the government treats people impersonally on the basis of citizenship and not their personal relationship to the people that run the government. There's a clear distinction between the public interest, which the government serves, and the private interests of the people running the government. And under those circumstances, you can have corruption, which is the appropriation of public resources for private gain. Now, I would argue make a couple of general observations. The first is that I actually think that the struggle to create modern administrative states is, and the difference between either patrimonial or neo-patrimonial states and modern states, is actually a more significant dividing line in world politics today than is the distinction between authoritarian and democratic states, because I actually think that it is relatively easy to create an electoral democracy. It is much, much harder to make the transition from a neo-patrimonial, highly corrupt, kind of rent-seeking regime to one that is modern and impersonal. And many of the ills of modern democracy stem from the fact that we don't have effective modern states. We have elections and we have some semblance of law, but we don't have modern public administration. The other observation is that especially Americans, because of their national experience, always tend to focus on the institutions of constraint, that is to say on the rule of law and on democratic accountability. They don't like to think about the state. And in fact, in the first chapter of Huntington's book, of Political Order and Changing Societies, he says the following: when an American thinks about the problem of government building, he directs himself not to the creation of authority and the accumulation of power, but rather the limitation of authority and the division of power. And he points out, and this was one of the basic themes of his book, that before you limit power, you actually have to be able to generate it. And we don't actually pay sufficient attention to that side of the equation. Let me just, before I turn to the United States, let me just very briefly give you some examples of why I think what seems to many people to be a kind of crisis of democracy is actually a crisis of state administration. Just begin with Ukraine, which came into public focus a year ago with the uprisings in Maidan Square that led to the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych as president. If you think about what's at stake for those protesters, or what's at stake between the United States and Putin's Russia, it's really not democracy, because Yanukovych was actually elected fair and square in a mostly free and fair election, as was Putin. If there was an election held in Moscow or in Russia tomorrow, he would win. He'd get 70, 80% popularity ratings. The issue is really the absence of a modern state in both of those countries. Yanukovych presided over a kleptocracy. He personally appropriated, probably tens of billions of dollars, managed to get it out of the country, two members of his family, and this was a classic government run by insiders for their own private benefit. And that's really the issue. That's what people, when they said they wanted to align Ukraine with the European Union, that's what they were talking about. They wanted to live in a modern state in which the government at least pretended to serve public interest rather than private enrichment. Or if you go closer to home, the Euro crisis problem of Greece at core was one of clientelism. So Greece became a democracy again after the colonel stepped down in 1974. You had a good alternation between the two center-right and center-left parties, PASOK and New Democracy. The only trouble is that what they did was they alternated in stuffing the Greek government with their own patronage appointments. And in fact, since you can't fire civil servants under their civil service rules in Greece, every time you had one of these frequent changes from one party to another, the civil service simply got larger to the point where you had 7 times the per capita number of public officials in Greece as you did in Britain at that moment. And that was the reason they couldn't control their wage bill. And even to this day, they've not made really fundamental reforms in eliminating party patronage as a source of how the political parties interact with Greek voters. And so I would say that I guess the final just illustration of this is just Iraq and Afghanistan, where the United States has been involved in these very difficult and costly state-building projects. And I think that we got both countries to the point where they could have, if not free and fair elections, sort of election-like events that kind of produced some degree of democratic legitimacy. But the one thing the United States really completely failed to do was to produce modern states, modern administrative states in either of those countries. And part of the longer-term failure really rests on the fact that issues like corruption are so deeply and endemically rooted there that it delegitimizes those governments and creates the opportunities for insurgency and the like. All right, so enough with the rest of the world. We move on to the United States. I believe that the United States also suffers from weakness in its public administration. Stephen Skowronek once described 19th century American government as a state of courts and parties, meaning that, so, the 3 parts of this tripod correspond to the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. And his argument was that in 19th century America, the executive branch was very much underdeveloped, and that a great deal of governance that in a European parliamentary system would be done through an executive branch agency in the United States tended to be done either by the courts or by Congress directly. And I believe that in a certain way this continues to be true despite the fact, as we all know, that there's been this enormous growth of an administrative state beginning in the progressive era and continuing through the 20th century. So I will get to this idea of why we're still living in a state of courts and parties in a moment. But I think it's helpful to walk a little bit through the history of this. I think that there is a permanent tension between the quality of public administration and democracy, and the easiest way to understand this is simply by looking at American history. The principle of democracy is political participation by the people. The principle of good public administration is merit, expertise, and impartiality. And those 2 basic tendencies have been at war in the United States for a good long time. I think that Americans, tend to look down on places like India or Brazil or Mexico where there's a high degree of clientelism, that is, these patron-client relationships. But the fact of the matter is that the United States invented clientelism. Up until the 1820s, the American government was really run by the friends of George Washington. It was a kind of elite matter. I mean, the federal government was minuscule at that point. But the people that ran it were, a lot of them graduates of Harvard and Yale, kind of the elite of this gentry, planter, merchant elite in the United States in the decades after the Revolution. This all changed in the 1828 election, which was the first one that, under the newly revised expanded franchise in most American states, and it was the beginning of the populist tradition led by Andrew Jackson. John Quincy Adams, who lost that election, was a typical Boston Brahmin. He traveled in Europe. He could speak many foreign languages. He was a graduate of Harvard University. His father was the second president of the United States. Andrew Jackson was a frontiersman from rural Tennessee, Scotch-Irish, a drinker, a brawler, who made his fame in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And when he was elected in that election, there was a heavy kind of anti-elite character to his campaign. He said the ordinary people of the United States don't want these graduates of Harvard running the country. And when he got into office, he said two things. First of all, I won the election, so I should appoint who works in the U.S. government. And secondly, he didn't put it quite in these terms, but in effect he said, any idiot can be a federal bureaucrat. And this is what inaugurates this long 100-year period in American history known as the spoils system or the patronage system. As it spreads through all levels of state, local, and federal government, you get to the point by the time of the Civil War, and I think everybody's familiar with Abraham Lincoln's complaints about the need to hand out patronage, but virtually every member of the U.S. government was put there as a result of a payoff from a politician to some political supporter. Now this begins to change in the 1880s, I think, as a result of social change. You have a rising middle class, you have greater urbanization, and you basically have a need for a more sophisticated kind of government, both at a municipal and at a federal level. And so key moment that shifts this away from patronage is the assassination of Garfield, who's elected in 1882. He takes about 6 weeks to die because he's shot by an office seeker, would-be office seeker. Congress, at this point, has no interest in reforming the system because that's how they all got to power. But because of this triggering event, they're all embarrassed, and even before the next Congress is voted into office, they vote for the Pendleton Act that establishes the first United States Civil Service Commission and the principle that you ought to be appointed on the basis of merit and technical expertise and not as a result of patronage. But because of the American check and balance system, this kind of reform, which was done in Britain in the Northcote Trevelyan reform in 1870, I mean, in Britain, this thing is implemented within the space of about 5 to 10 years. In the United States, it takes another 40 years to get to about 80% of the federal civil service being classified, because there's a constant rearguard action by essentially by Congress to protect the right of patronage. Now, I think that there is a fair amount of evidence that we've gone backwards since the middle of the 20th century in terms of the quality of the federal bureaucracy. There are a number of indicators of this. I would simply refer you to, let's say, the two Volcker Commission reports on public service that provide a lot of data on who works in the U.S. government and the levels of educational background and morale and the like. The FedView survey that's been done every year covers a lot of American civil servants is actually pretty depressing. If you look at some of the figures over time, in the most recent surveys, only 9% said that their agency was very good at disciplining poor performance. 67% responded not too good or not good at all, and those numbers have been going down fairly steadily. And it's interesting because politicization has reinserted itself into federal employment, but not in the way that it happened in the 19th century. So there, it was just a direct individual payoff. You got a job in the post office if you supported a particular politician. Today, you have other kinds of political criteria being introduced. So, probably the most recent and most important one is veterans preference. So, approximately, Max, this is right, 50% of all new federal hires these days are veterans, and of that, perhaps another half of that number are disabled veterans. Veterans are a very deserving group, and you can understand politically why this happened. But if you want to create a workforce that is high quality, if you want, to run a Google and you had to have half of your employees come out of this pool of people, you probably wouldn't get the greatest sort of organization. And I think we've seen a lot of failures of government in the last few years. The Iraq War, the implementation of the Iraq War, the response to Hurricane Katrina, healthcare.gov, the most recent scandal in the Veterans Administration, I think all speak to real problems in our ability to implement policies that are mandated by Congress. So I want to now move over into a discussion of why it is that we are in this state of courts and parties and what some of the sources of this kind of administrative dysfunction are. So the larger context, I think, is the following. There are a couple of big social trends that have been going on in the United States, which, when combined with the American institutional structure set in the Constitution, have led to a very gridlocked and indecisive political system. Two social trends. The first one is polarization. So this is something everybody is talking about. This is something that actually political scientists can measure pretty well. So if you look at something like the DW Nominate scores that measure the ideological positioning of members of Congress, for most of the 20th century, the two parties overlapped very substantially, but then beginning in the late 1990s, they began splitting apart, and now there's no overlap whatsoever. So the most liberal Republican is now considerably more conservative than the most conservative Democrat, all right? And that, I think, has been apparent to a lot of people just, turning on cable TV in recent years. Second, I'm not sure whether this is a social trend, as it mixes with the institutional rules as well, but the second trend is the rise of very well organized and very well resourced interest groups. If you look at the number of lobbyists, they have exploded since the late 1980s. The amount of money going into elections and campaigning has gone up very steadily. Now, neither of these phenomena in themselves necessarily leads to bad government. In a parliamentary system, most parties don't overlap. They are very ideological, and there's a lot of party discipline, and so they tend not to agree on a lot of things. Where it gets to be problematic is when it meets up with the American system of checks and balances. If you look at the American political system comparatively, meaning compared to other developed democracies, we are way over at the far side in terms of the number of veto players or checks and balances that our system provides. And there's good reason for this. The Founding Fathers wanted to maximize individual liberty. They wanted to prevent tyranny from arising, and so they designed an extremely complex constitutional system in which power was split between many different parts of the government. So you have two houses of Congress we've got an extraordinarily powerful upper house that doesn't exist in many European parliamentary systems. And by the way, two countries that do have very powerful upper houses, Japan and Italy, have both proposed getting rid of them in recent years because they also have been deadlocked by the fact that their upper house can't agree with their with their lower house. We have federalism. We devolve power to states and localities. We've got a very powerful judiciary with the right of judicial review. And the checks and balances, those are all mandated in the Constitution, but they've actually been spreading just as a result of ordinary practice. So, for example, any single senator can put a hold on any given executive branch nominee, and they don't even have to explain the reasons for this. So you imagine, again, running a Google in which you had a board of directors with 100 members, each of which could veto any one of Larry Page's decisions to hire a manager at that company. It wouldn't work very well. So we have what I described in the book as a vetocracy. I know that in terms of the American experience and American traditions, we are extremely proud of the fact that we have this system of checks and balances, but I believe that you can have a system with too many checks and balances, where it becomes extremely easy for the government for a well-organized minority to use its influence through these institutional rules to block decisions by the majority. It blocks tyranny, but it also prevents the government from doing things like passing budgets, which we haven't done by our rules or by Congress's own rules really since 2008. So let me talk about specifically the ways in which the other branches, the courts and parties, play into the system and decrease the quality of public administration. So again, just to back up a little bit on a more theoretical level, in my view, quality of public administration, or quality of bureaucracy in general, and this applies to the private sector as much as the public sector, depends on the interaction of a couple of things. It depends on the capacity of the organization, resources and people, the numbers of people, their training, and the resources they deploy. And it also depends to a large degree on the amount of authority that is delegated to them. And in general, I think the best run organizations are ones that have very high capacity in which the principals in the system feel safe in delegating fairly substantial amounts of authority to lower levels of their organization. But there are always, of course, dangers in this because once you delegate, you lose control and so forth. And so I think a lot of basic management revolves around this basic problem. So in my view, because of American political culture that is so intensely suspicious of government power and of the executive branch in particular, we don't delegate well. And we place certain kinds of constraints on the ability to actually execute policy that does not exist in most parliamentary systems. And I guess it's not a secret, but having taught comparative politics for quite a few years, I've actually come to think that parliamentary systems as a whole tend to work better than presidential ones. But let's begin with the courts. The United States is very peculiar in that we allow private citizens to enforce laws. This is not something that is done in virtually any other liberal democracy, and it comes as a result of our particular history, particularly the history arising out of slavery and segregation. In the United States, it was impossible, particularly in the southern states, to trust the government to actually enforce laws, and this is why the Topeka, Kansas School Board had to be sued by a private voluntary organization, the NAACP, to desegregate its school system in a way that led to, as we know, the Brown versus Board of Education landmark court decision. This is a very heroic narrative. It is very dear to many Americans, but it is also, in comparative terms, a strange way of doing things, because in a parliamentary democracy, what you have is a legislature that would decide that they're going to desegregate. They would tell their justice ministry to go out and then actually implement this in the school system or through the education ministry or whatnot. But because of the way that power is divided in the United States, this was not possible in the 1950s, and you had to use the courts to do this. And in general, I think on both the left and the right, there is such a distrust of executive power that we don't actually trust the executive branch to enforce its own or the rules that Congress has made. And so in the social and economic legislation, those 12, 13 big pieces of legislation passed in the late 60s, 1970s, Congress substantially expanded standing to allow private individuals to sue the government either to enforce a law or to prevent it from enforcing a rule that they didn't want. And again, this is all understandable in terms of American political history, but it drives up transaction costs, and it also makes the actual implementation very problematic. I'll just give you, I'm sorry, I don't like to do things by anecdote, but this one really hit me because I used to live in McLean, Virginia for many years, a very nice suburb, one of the richest counties in the whole United States. In our neighborhood, about every other house had a sidewalk in front of it. And then in the other ones, the lawn would just come straight down to the street. So one day, Fairfax County starts installing wheelchair ramps in those few parts of the street that had sidewalks. And if you think about it, this made no sense whatsoever, because if you had a wheelchair, you would go for about a block, and then the sidewalk would end. Then you have to go out into the street, past the next house, and then back onto the sidewalk when it resumed, and so forth. So Fairfax County government is a pretty good government as far as county government. So why are they doing this? It's idiotic, right? They almost certainly could have figured out more efficient ways of spending their money, but I think that they were basically afraid of being sued under the Americans with Disabilities Act because the mandate that Congress wrote was a very, very excessively broad one that did not permit discretion in the way that local government officials would implement this. So they're not allowed to say, well, it's just stupid and a waste of money to put wheelchair ramps in this particular neighborhood. And there's actually this case of a fellow named Trevor Pinnock in Julian, California, that launched something like 280 suits against local businesses for not installing these wheelchair ramps, and he won, and every local business, then had to bear that cost. So you can multiply, examples like this where it's basically what Robert Kagan refers to as adversarial legalism that has inserted the courts into what in other democracies would be simply done as an administrative matter. On the question of the party side of it, it seems to me that in the United States, Congress inserts itself into the governing process in a much more microscopic and complex way than, again, in most other parliamentary democracies. So the clearest case of this is just in budgeting. In most parliamentary systems, budgets are drawn up in the government. They're done by the Treasury. In Britain, as a matter of fact, the cabinet instructs the government to come up with a budget. They do that in the Queen's speech. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, presents the budget, and it's voted in a single up or down vote in Parliament, and it usually takes about a week to do that. And as you're aware, in our country, it is entirely the prerogative of Congress to write budgets, and it is much harder to coordinate the activities of 535 individuals than it is, to do it through a single economic bureaucracy. And this, results in this whole series of battles that we've had where Congress is constantly trying to impose rules on itself to bind its ability to manipulate the budget, and then, failing to observe that kind of discipline. As I said, I think that the handoff of authority from Congress to the executive branch is really critical. I mean, the specific nature of the mandate that's given. And I think what we've tended to do in this country is one of two things. Either the mandate is excessively detailed and restrictive, as in the federal acquisitions regulations or these unbelievable requirements for hiring a federal employee, or Congress goes to the other end and basically abdicates its responsibility in defining what the agencies have to do, and then throws it into the lap of the courts to then adjudicate exactly how far executive discretion ought to extend, rather than, in my view, doing what it ought to do, which is to make a mandate that delegates an appropriate amount of administrative discretion, but puts clear boundaries on that and clear performance standards, and also gets rid of this problem of multiple principal. And one of the reasons that the economist principal and agent framework doesn't work when you think about the American government is that it assumes that there's one principle. In the United States, we've potentially got 535 principles, and this is why you get 50 programs for worker retraining, 82 programs for improving teacher training. If you want to know what these individuals in this five-sided building on the other side of the Potomac River spend all of their time doing, most of it is actually writing one of the 500 reports that is annually due to Congress as a result of a mandate that some probably long-dead congressman imposed on the U.S. Department of Defense. And I think this is an example, I think, of an improper, the improper handing off of authority to an administrative agency. This is a problem that would not exist in a parliamentary system because the executive is an emanation of the legislature. David Brooks, Paul wanted to invite him. He wrote this piece where he was actually commenting on one of the chapters in my book and saying, yes, well, the solution is to strengthen the executive branch. That does not work in our system. It does not work in a presidential system. You think the Republicans in Congress, and especially in this new Congress, are going to say, yes, the solution to our problems of government dysfunction is to give Obama more authority to, make decisions on it. It doesn't work. So I think that this is the situation that we're in, where you get, it's not a crisis. The decay in the American political system is, in my view, not something that's going to threaten the life of the republic. And in fact, our economy is doing pretty well, despite all of these problems. We're the only developed country now that seems to be growing, and we've got a very vibrant private sector, and that seems to just plow ahead regardless of the dysfunction in Washington. But we pay a very high price for all of this in terms of policies that are really implemented very inefficiently. The Dodd-Frank Act and the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, two landmark pieces of legislation passed early on in the Obama administration. I happen to be big supporters of both of them. I think we should have universal health care, and I think we desperately need to regulate Wall Street. But they are terrible pieces of legislation. They're terrible pieces of legislation. Both of them are hundreds of pages long. The people that voted for them do not know what's in them. And the reason is that most of that language was written by lobbyists as the price that was paid to get these things actually out the door of Congress. And so, so I think that these are all issues that we will need to address in the coming years. I started thinking about I'm not a specialist in American government. I'm actually a specialist in more comparative politics and global democracy. And one of the things that has really struck me in recent years, especially with my, let's say Chinese students, of whom I get a lot, is that 20 years ago, virtually every one of these foreign students, if you asked them, what they wanted their country to look like, they would have said, I want it to look like the United States. And I think you hear that much less commonly these days, because I think American democracy in its detailed functioning just is not performing in a way that seems to be much of a model to many people. And so I think in terms of the ability of the United States to project its power and influence around the world, we need to address this. So I'm sorry, I spoke much longer than I intended to, but thank you for your attention. I really look forward to the panelists.
Actually, you're right on time, and probably have put us a bit ahead of schedule, which is not a bad thing. Thank you very, very much. It tees up the issues very nicely. Paul Verkuylen and I are kind of the co-chairs of this, and we kind of discuss between ourselves. that, of course, it'd be wonderful to do a Q&A with Frank right now, but then we would quickly be getting into exactly what we want to do with the panels. So we've elected to move directly into the panels where we explore a couple of these issues more deeply, issues of political structure and good government. And so you'll certainly have a chance to hear more from Frank. Frank will have a chance to respond to the panels. But we think it's better to kind of get on with that than to stop now and try to do a Q&A. So it is 1 o'clock, and I would suggest we take just a 15-minute break, and we start at 1:15. And nobody ever objects, I've learned, if you end a program early, which in an academic program is rare, but is often desirable. So once again, restrooms right outside the glass doors on your right. There's more food and beverage. And let's settle back here in 15 minutes, and we'll start a bit early at 1:15 with the first of our 2 panels. Let me mention one other thing, just in fairness to all of you, that I failed to mention earlier. We are, in fact, recording these sessions, and we will make a webcast available on our website, and it may be linked to on Paul's. We haven't really discussed all that, but just so you're aware, we are going to record and webcast both Frank's presentation as well as the panels, just so you know. All right, we'll take a break. We'll be back in 15 minutes, 1:15.